Let's start with asking both of you, how do you define anti-Semitism? How do you define anti-Zionism? And when, in your opinion, is anti-Zionism and anti-Israel rhetoric anti-Semitic? Let me start with Professor Porat.
On May 2016, on May 16, the IRA, International Remembrance Holocaust Alliance, a non-Jewish body that embodies some, at that time, 31 countries, adopted, I'd like to emphasize this word, a working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, how does this working definition define anti-Semitism? It speaks about a perception, a negative perception, of course, of Jews that results in deep feelings against, it says hatred. I'm not sure about this word hatred. Hostility, certainly, towards Jews, and it is being expressed in all kinds of expressions, verbal, visual, physical. And after this initial short definition, there is a line, a list of examples. 7 of them say what are anti-Semitic cases, like denying the Holocaust, like dehumanizing Jews, like delegitimizing the Jewish people, describe it in medieval terms, etc., etc. We all know that this story. And then come 4 points which have made this definition a bone of contention, because they say when anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic. Before delving into these 4 points, 4 or 5, I would like to add one more. I'd like to give one more short definition of anti-Semitism. And this is, so I believe at least, that you can put it, it's my responsibility. Anti-Semitism is the discrepancy between what Jews really are and between the anti-Semitic mind, mentality, imagination, think they are. There is a huge discrepancy, and this is the essence of anti-Semitism. Now to the second question, what is anti-Zionism and when is it anti-Semitic? Well, anti-Zionism, if you take it semantically, it is being against Zionism, which is the national movement of the Jewish people, aspiring for the Jewish people to come back to its homeland, establish a state, a Jewish state, and run it. If you are against this goal and against the existence even, not just the goals, but against the existence of this national movement, or against the existence of the state that this movement has created, then you are an anti-Zionist. Now, we said that the working definition has some 4 points, you can add to them a bit, which say when anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Okay, first of all, when the language used by anti-Zionists is actually anti-Semitic, when it uses symbols, stereotypes, old labels, then it is anti-Semitism because it uses the tools of anti-Semitism. Then, if you depict the Jewish people and the Jews that support Israel and Israel, you depict them as a cosmic evil that is responsible for every wrong under the sun, okay, in a disproportionate way, the way you do to Jews, or the way you think about Jews, then again, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. If you go against, as an anti-Zionist, You go against the very existence of a Jewish state. This is, before you come to anti-Semitism, it is at least a gross discrimination, because why is this specific national movement and state, why is it not worthy of existence? Whenever I get to this point, I cannot avoid asking, why every tiny island in the Pacific with some 20,000 inhabitants has the right to have a vote in the United Nations, to have a flag, a hymn, etc., and a nation that is 3,000 years old and has contributed in an unparalleled manner to humanity, starting with the Bible, why does we have to fight every day to justify the existence of the state? Now, one more line is, of course, distorting the history of the Holocaust, the meaning of the Holocaust, and comparing Israelis and Jews who support it to the Nazis. Now, this is not a simple comparison. The Nazis are not worthy of existence. You don't just say that they are Nazis because you're on the left and you think that that Israel is a racist endeavor or whatever. When you say, when you bring up this comparison, and you know that the Nazis are not worthy of existing, and the whole free world was enlisted to demise them, then the state of Israel, if compared to Nazis, is not worthy of existence.
I think we very much understood your position, your definitions, and we'll be back to you. Let's just pass on to David Myers now.
So let me try and address your questions, Michael, as best I can. I think Dina did a very good job in laying out some of the definitional apparatus for anti-Semitism as reflected in the IHRA working definition. And I don't plan to sort of repeat a catalog of characteristics of anti-Semitism. What I guess I would say is that in the first instance, anti-Semitism is about hatred of Jews. And here I want to call attention to two properties of anti-Semitism that I think are essential to really understanding its perdurance, its persistence. And they are a set of contradictory qualities that I think give it its particular force. One is its astonishing malleability, the capacity of anti-Semitism to assume many different and indeed contradictory forms, such that out of the same mouth one can hear representations of Jews as arch-capitalists intent on global domination, or revolutionary socialists intent on overturning the existing world order. And I think if we look at the long history of anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, Judeophobia, whatever term one uses, one sees that malleability is important to understanding its staying power. Now, some would say, as indeed some have said very prominently recently, that the phenomenon is so malleable, so elastic, that the term anti-Semitism doesn't make sense. I arrive at the opposite conclusion, that it's precisely that quality of its malleability that gives it its force and in a sense compels us to hold on to the term. The other quality that I think helps explain the unique force of anti-Semitism is in tension with the criterion of malleability, and that is anti-Semitism's essentialism. Just as anti-Semitism includes a vast array, a vast stock of images, perceptions, and representations of Jews, so too each one of them drills down and claims this is the ineradicable quality of the Jew in its purest form. And I think these are two properties of anti-Semitism that help us understand its persistence. So instead of a list of particular characteristics, I want to begin by mentioning those properties. Second observation, anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world, in the United States, and this is indeed cause for great concern. I think it's important to add, and this is a third point, that certainly in the United States, but I think not only in the United States, the greatest threat comes from right-wing nationalists who tap into long-standing conspiratorial fantasies about Jewish world domination. And I think it's really important to understand both what the nature of the threat is and where it comes from. It's no surprise that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security identified in September white nationalism as the greatest terrorist threat that the United States faces. And so too, in terms of anti-Semitism, which, as I said, is on the rise. The Anti-Defamation League released recently its 2019 audit of anti-Semitic incidents, which revealed the highest number of such incidents since it began counting them in 1979. So the phenomenon is on the rise, and we need to know where the most dangerous versions are coming from. But now let's get closer to the question that, the second question you asked. Because there is a persistent concern about anti-Zionism as another source of anti-Semitism, very often identified as anti-Semitism from the left, though there are anti-Zionists on the right, just as there are, I think, anti-Semitic pro-Zionists, a phenomenon that we have seen in the last decade or so. So there's been a very considerable amount of attention devoted to the equation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. As Dina suggested, a number of the items on the list of the IHRA working definition take up this particular equation. And what I would say is that I think there are indeed moments when anti-Zionism veers into anti-Semitism, but I certainly don't believe that all forms of anti-Zionism are anti-Semitic. And so when is it anti-Semitic, anti-Zionism, and when is it not? And sometimes it's very difficult to say. These are really difficult judgment calls to make. But I guess, Michael, that's what we're here to try to do. So let me suggest some instances where I think I can agree to the identification or equation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, cases in which I think there is a strong case to be made that anti-Zionism veers into anti-Semitism. And this is indeed working off of some of the IHRA criteria itself. So I would say the global ascription of guilt, the equation of Jews and Israelis, the equation of actions of the Israeli government with the beliefs or deeds of Jews writ large, as a collective or as individuals. So again, holding Jews outside of Israel responsible for the actions of the Israeli government, which taps into all sorts of standard anti-Semitic tropes like the dual loyalty of Jews, the disproportionate power of Jews, the appetite for global domination. So this would be one instance in which I think we can see an equation. A second that concerns me, the arrogation of the right to name who or what Jews are to other people than Jews. So, for example, when I hear people say Jews are not a nation, they're not a people, but rather members of a religious group, I think that denies to Jews the right to self-definition. And it parallels, to a certain extent, the claim that Jews have no right to a land that they call home. This belongs to the broader phenomenon of denialism that I think we see prominently, I should say, on both sides of the Israel-Palestine dispute. Both supporters of Israel and supporters of the Palestinians engage in this kind of denialism that I think is very deleterious to any sort of serious effort at conflict resolution. A third example that I think blurs the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, which I just hinted at, the denial of the right to the Jews to a place under the sun, a place of refuge. Jews do not have a right to be in the land of Israel. They don't have a connection to it, and they should take leave of it. They have usurped it, and they have no right. And fourth, I'll speak more to that in just a minute. Fourth, something that Dina concluded with, which is the equation of Jews, or for that matter, Israelis and Nazis. Israeli government officials are akin to Nazis. This is a kind of historical analogy and inversion that betrays serious historical ignorance and sometimes deliberate distortion. So these are some of the cases in which I think we can say that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism do overlap, at least on my reading. But when is it not the case that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, when is it the case that they do not merge? And here I just have to call attention to the fact that there's a long history of, amongst others, Jewish anti-Zionists who did not deem themselves anti-Semitic, who were opposed to the Zionist project, or perhaps agnostic about it, whom I think not only did they not consider themselves anti-Semites, but we shouldn't consider them anti-Semites either. And that is an opening to the proposition that not all forms of anti-Zionism need be deemed anti-Semitism. And I'm going to go right now to a very controversial claim, one that was rooted at the heart of the Durban Conference. And that is the claim that Israel is a racist state, which I would suggest is not necessarily anti-Semitic. And here I should just make a brief historical observation that many of us remember that in 1975, the United Nations General Assembly resolved that Zionism was equivalent to racism. And I think at that time, that was a deeply troubling and disturbing proposition, and should be recognized as that. But here we are 45 years later, and the situation is different. I think a good part of that claim about Zionism as, or the state of Israel as possessing racist characteristic attaches to the occupation of the West Bank, where there is a clear distinction between Jews and Arabs in terms of citizenship rights, legal status, and basic physical infrastructure. So we're not in 1975, we're 45 years later, and to the extent that one suggests that the occupation is laced with racist sensibilities, I personally don't think that necessarily is anti-Semitic, because I think there's something to be said for that claim. And similarly, I think those who suggest that Israel has introduced an apartheid-style regime, at least with respect to the West Bank, and I would say, in my case, limited to the West Bank, do not necessarily veer into anti-Semitism. And here I would urge those who have not yet had a chance to do so to read the very detailed report by one of Israel's leading human rights lawyers, Michael Sfard, for the nonprofit, the NGO Yesh Din, in which he discusses in very technical detail, calling attention to existing international legal standards, why Israel's regime in the West Bank can be deemed, in technical terms, apartheid. So I think when one reads Sfard's opinion, and I regard Sfard, in fact, as a great patriot, seeking to uphold human rights as he understands them to be represented in Israel's own Declaration of Independence, I think for me it becomes hard to globally dismiss that assertion about the apartheid status, at least in the West Bank, as anti-Semitic. Third, the claim that Israel should not be a Jewish state. For many, that is akin to anti-Semitism. And I think sometimes it can be, but sometimes it is not. For example, I think that those who advocate for the state of Israel as the state of all its citizens, who account for a unique or distinctive connection of Jews to the land of Israel, and provide for the cultural rights and physical security of Jews, are not necessarily anti-Semites. They are proposing an alternative political framework for Israel based upon principles of justice, fairness, and equality. And I think to make the claim that Israel should no longer be a Jewish state is not, in that regard, necessarily anti-Semitic. This goes to one of the criteria identified in the IHRA report, which is that denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination is anti-Semitic. And here I think it's important to distinguish between self-determination and sovereignty for the purposes of our efforts to distinguish anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism. I don't think this is a distinction without a difference. I think it matters. I think to deny that Jews have a right to a place of safe haven, to deny that Jews have a right to be in the land, is different from saying that Israel must be in perpetuity a state of the Jews or a Jewish state as opposed to a state of all its citizens. I think one has to take a look at some of the people who give voice to this view that Israel should be a state of all its citizens. So one such person is the leader of the Joint Arab List, member of Knesset Ayman Odeh, who makes precisely this point without denying the Jews a right to a place in the land and that polity that he imagines taking rise. The fact that arrangements such as this, the idea of the state of all its citizens, harks back to older ideas that were once considered, albeit in minoritarian fashion, doesn't make them, I think, either irrelevant or anti-Semitic. I think, especially in a moment of political stasis and political thinking, it doesn't hurt to sort of go back to the old historical repository and see what ideas can be learned from. So what I would conclude by saying is, I think there are instances, including in the IHRA definition, where the claim of anti-Semitism based on anti-Zionism does not hold up. In each of these cases, there may well be anti-Semitic versions, but I think there are also instances like upholding the belief in the state of Israel as the state of all citizens that can be deemed not anti-Semitic as well. I'll conclude there.
Okay, thank you, David. And I think we're right in the middle of the discussion where we might even see disagreements here on the panel. Let me bring this back to Dina Porat. Dina, I don't know, maybe you want to respond, maybe you have some differing views, especially when it comes to racism and apartheid. And then I also want to ask you if there are any examples you would see where maybe anti-Semitism is also the weapon of the A word is misused for political reasons as well. But first, maybe you want to say something about what we just heard.
And let me definitely respond to my friend and colleague David with the following arguments. We try to define anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. When anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you brought in when it is not, but we didn't speak about the reasons. Now, you mentioned the 1975 resolution, which was of the United Nations, that Zionism equals racism, but you didn't tell us that it was revoked in December 1991 and annulled when the Soviet Union fell apart, because one of the main reasons of enlisting the left and the intellectual left against Zionism and against Zionist inspirations were Soviet aspirations to enlist the third world, the Arab world, for its interests, and to defame Israel as Zionism and Zionists as collaborators with the Nazis, in order to take off their heads the claim that they signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that they didn't see the signs of the German invasion coming, etc. And it was in their interest, for the sake of narrative and historical narrative, to put Nazis on Zionism's head. This is one main reason that we should take into account, that is that the source of anti-Zionism is not what Zionism is or what Israel is doing, but interests of the Soviet Union. And then another reason is the academic left that caters always for the underdog, for rights of all kinds of groups, minorities that are deprived, etc. And with them, automatically, Israel is an occupying brutal force, whatever, and the Palestinians are on the righteous and virtuous side. The third reason is that for this argumentation is I thank you, David, for using the word inversion when you spoke about Nazis and Israelis. But there is one more inversion that came up during the last decades when conflicts involved more and more religious aspects. And this is an inversion in which Jews and Israel must be the Antichrist, because they certainly cannot be on the side of the sufferer and the one who brings salvation, like Jesus Christ. And once the opposite, politically and theologically, was found and merged in the image and the existence of the Palestinians, then they are in all caricatures nailed on the cross, continue the crucifixion, dripping blood, etc., while Israel is the other side, is the Antichrist. A fourth reason, and I quote here Robert Wistrich, the late great scholar, who said, why anti-Zionism? Because first of all, the Christian world, but the Muslim as well, has not yet swallowed the fact that Jews came back to their homeland and made themselves a state. They were not supposed to. They were not supposed to. This is not part of the unwritten agreement between the Christian and then the Muslim world and the Jews. They should have had a definitely different place. Now, to one more reason that you stated, David, and this is the occupation. Let me remind you that today, when you look at the situation carefully, not just from the outside or with political opinions, there is a Palestinian Authority. Israel is not present inside the territories. There are many relations, cultural, economic. You should have seen the help and the support that Israel gave the Palestinian Authority now regarding the COVID-19, for instance. The Gaza Strip is not governed by Israel, it's by the Hamas. We are on the outside. We are not in the inside. There was a survey among East Jerusalem citizens. They have a blue Israeli identity card, the Arab neighborhoods. There was a survey which asked them when there will be two states solution, Israeli and Palestinian state, which is a solution favored by many Israelis. Which country would you like to belong? And they said, are you out of your mind? To Israel, of course. So I think you depicted apartheid and occupation and racism in much harsher terms than reality. I think I urge you to rethink these terms. Of course, there is a troubled relationship. There are problems, but you know that even when there is a military operation in Gaza after they bomb our kibbutzim and moshavim, etc., 2 hours a day, the fighting stops so that trucks with equipment, with cement, with medicines, etc., can go from Israel to the Gaza Strip. There are many such instances that your depiction ignores. And I would say that there is a problem, there is a troubled reality. We could have, there are instances that we regret many times, but there are many more instances to be regretted from the other side. I think the whole picture should be taken, especially the Palestinian refusal one time after the other to make peace and accept Israeli propositions. And this has not been said by you, and I definitely regret that. And I'd like to say that if you take the 195 countries, member states of the United Nations, and put them on a list, on a scale, okay, and rate them by their attitudes to minorities, to their neighbors, to people they are in dispute with, human rights, women's rights, etc., Israel is in a very good place. But still, there is no movement, for instance, anti-Belgism for what Belgium did in the Congo. No, there is anti-Zionism because Israel is a Jewish state. And here I come to your point about Israel being a state of all its citizens. It's naive to think, with all due respect, that this is going to work as one state for all its citizens that with no Jewish nature. This was not the goal. There are so many Arab states, so many states and just one Jewish state. It will deprive the Jewish state of its nature, of its goal, of its tradition. And the two-state solution, that's one thing, another thing. But a state of all its citizens that would blare anything or everything, that has been achieved so far.
Michael, I'm sorry, I have to respond briefly to some of Dina's points. I'll try and be as brief as I can. Let me begin with the last point. So whether or not it's naive, Dina, I don't think that's the question. The question is whether voicing support, endorsing the idea of Israel as a state of all its citizens is anti-Semitic or not. And here I believe it is not necessarily anti-Semitic. That was the point.
Agree.
We can discuss. We're not here to discuss what we think is the ultimate ideal outcome for Israel. That's a different question and a different matter and a different. I think Michael's taking that up next semester. But this semester is about anti-Semitism. I would say to maintain that is not necessarily anti-Semitic. That's the point. Second, with regard to the occupation, I think we just have very different understandings of what's going on. First, I guess I would say that as a matter of international law, to my mind, the occupation and the building of settlements is illegal according to international law, according to the 49th clause of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And we begin with that, and then we move to the reality on the ground, which I don't know, because you're prohibited from going, when the last time you went into the Palestinian parts of the West Bank, but I don't know when you've been through a checkpoint, but I can assure you, having spent time there relatively recently, it's not the perception of most Palestinians with whom I've been in touch, whom I'm in regular touch with, that Israel's presence is completely outside. Israel's presence is ubiquitous, is everywhere. It's pervasive, and in many instances, it's suffocating. And I think that's why Sfard arrived at the conclusions he did, not with the a priori intention of defaming his country, but on the basis of a very careful analysis. So we could go back and forth on this one for a long time, but I think we're just going to have to agree to disagree on what the nature of the occupation is and whether or not one can describe it as either racist or apartheid and be deemed anti-Semitic as a result of that being the question. Not even whether it's racist or apartheid, but whether saying so is anti-Semitic. I want to now just jump in on a few other points, and then Michael, forgive me. There is undeniably, Dina, you're right, a selectivity of focus upon Israel, and it's especially apparent amongst the left. You're absolutely right. You're 195 countries in the UN. I think that's absolutely right. And it's unsettling, and it indeed is part of, I think, what unnerves me about BDS. There's a lot more we can say about that. I just want to say two things. When I think of BDS and that selectivity of focus, I think of my own students on the UCLA campus. I think of the Jewish students who were raised with a very strong connection to Israel, who were educated to love Israel and be proud of Israel. And I see the wound that BDS inflicts upon them. It's a wound. It's a deep wound. But I also try and wear another set of glasses. I also see BDS through the eyes of my Palestinian American students who have deep connections to the land. Sometimes they've never been there. They haven't been allowed to go, or it's been very difficult for them to go. They speak Arabic. They foster a connection to Palestinian culture. And what I have to tell you is that for those students, they're not animated to support BDS because they hate Jews. They see it as a non-violent form of resistance to the occupation, which can allow Palestinians to achieve self-determination. I think it's really important, and here I'm speaking, I understand, principally about the American context and principally about the nature of life on college campuses. And I think by juxtaposing the perspective of the Jewish American student, the Palestinian American student, we can see how difficult this question is, because BDS can be deeply wounding and painful to Jewish students. And it can be, for the Palestinian American students, the sole nonviolent means of expression of resistance to the occupation. And I guess the question I have, and this cuts to, the whole, I suppose, takeaway from our conversation: what are we to do? Is this a place at which we say the law must come in and establish a structure so that we can prohibit these forms of expression because we deem them anti-Semitic? I mean, to the eyes of my Palestinian American student, to call his position anti-Semitic would be ludicrous. They have no hatred for Jews. I mean, the ones I'm talking about, others may. So what are we going to do? We're going to bring in a legal mechanism that calls assertions that Israel is racist discrimination and makes one who makes that claim liable to some form of legal punishment, liable to forms of financial or other liability. That's where I think this question becomes particularly complex, because we can talk about our differences over the content of anti-Semitism, and we talk about our different conceptions of the equation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. My question is, what then do we do with, even if we accept that some forms of anti-Zionism may be anti-Semitism, what do we do? What are we trying to propose? And I fear, especially given recent attempts by the Trump administration, like in the attempt to extend Title VI to cover Jews on the basis of national origin, or some efforts by the Education Department, I fear that the law is a very coarse instrument to try and address some of these very complicated questions. So, Michael, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I mean, we're right in the middle of it. I think we can go on for a while. I will ask Dina to reply.
May I just add one sentence?
And then I also want to take some questions from the audience. I should say you answered already a lot of the questions from the audience. And one thing which is really, causes, of course, a lot of people to agree or disagree is that the two of you disagree, which is always good for a discussion, but it also shows how sensitive and how difficult and complex it is to answer this question. But please, Dina, go ahead.
Obviously we do not agree, and it is clear, and I think it's okay.
Okay, I'm afraid we lost you, Dina. I am just taking a couple of students first. Ben Holtzman, who is in my class, asks, I agree with your point, Professor Myers, on BDS. Your focus seems to be on the intent of Palestinian and non-Palestinian. Would you agree that the measurable actions of BDS are anti-Semitic, that the consequences of the intent, no matter how innocent the intent, result in anti-Semitic action?
Ben, that's a really great question. And I guess what I would say is I think some people who support BDS are motivated by anti-Semitism, and some people who support BDS are not motivated by anti-Semitism. BDS emerged in 2005 in Palestine in the West Bank as a nonviolent movement of protest after the collapse of the Second Intifada, which was violent. And it has three main planks. First, an end to the occupation. Second, full rights for Palestinian citizens in Israel. And third, the right of return. So I would say that the first two are, by my count, absolutely unproblematic as legitimate and legitimate demands without any taint of anti-Semitism. The right of return is one of those instances in which I think it really lies in the eyes of the beholder. From an Israeli Zionist Jewish perspective, the right of return seems to imply the eradication of Israel. The question I ask, and you're really perceptive to point to the question of intent, is the intent of the right of return to eradicate the Jewish presence in the land of Israel and to remove Jews altogether? Or is the intent to confer a measure of dignity and respect and to allow for the realization of the long-deferred aspirations of Palestinians to a place under the sun themselves? And I think these questions of intent are really significant, really important. And so what that leads me to conclude is, I think for some, the right of return consciously means getting rid of the Jews, and for others, it means the realization of the Palestinians' long-deferred goals. And I would just conclude by saying that it is reported that in the very late, we might even call it terminal stages of the Oslo peace process, we're talking about January 2001, when Bill Clinton was packing up his bags, but nonetheless pushing to see if a final resolution could be achieved. It is said that second-tier negotiators achieved some sort of agreement on the question of refugees, which would include the following features: recognition of the right of return, agreement that the two parties would agree on where that right of return was to be implemented. And by all accounts, then it was to be implemented in the new state of Palestine that would take rise. And then third, some nominal figure of Palestinian refugees allowed to return to Israel proper. So I think for those people, the right of return was not seen as anti-Semitic. I think in other eyes and hands it can be. So it's one of those instances in which I think there are really two ways to see it, two lenses through which to see it. And in some instances it's anti-Semitic, in some instances not.
Thank you, David. I'm taking another question, which is, combining another question, two questions. One by my student Ray Korn, who basically asked, when we talk about Zionism, what kind of Zionism are we talking about? Is it necessarily the founder Zionism? And I'm adding here, well, maybe Zionism today is the settler Zionism or a different Zionism altogether. That's the one question. Another question I also found will be interesting because it goes into a different direction when we talk about anti-Zionism, is by Edna Bryn-Neumann, and it asks about the Orthodox. So if the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi population, is anti-Zionist, so some of them are anti-Zionist, some of them are violently anti-Zionist, like David, you deal with the Satmar community, for example. Are those anti-Semitic as well? So these are two questions. I go to Dina first.
Let me thank you for the two questions. Well, I think you have good students. And I'll start with the Orthodox. I think David has already said that, and I have carefully read his paper in this Journal of Israel History, which he mentioned before. The internal internal Jewish debate, whether Zionism is the way to go, I don't think can be branded anti-Semitic. The Bund, the party, the Yiddishist party, was vehemently against Zionism. The Orthodox, no doubt, because Zionism is secular, it didn't wait for the Messiah. We know all that. The territorialists, the autonomists, the communists, all of them, or rather most of the lines of thinking in the Jewish people, inside the Jewish people at the late 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, when Zionism was born, political Zionism were against Zionism, no doubt. After the Holocaust, most of these solutions were proved to be an illusion. Communism, territorialism, the Bund was not existent anymore. Those who are still vehemently anti-Zionists are the Orthodox. And there is some kind of coexistence between them and the state authorities, which sometimes is not coexisting, but violent coexisting. And especially now regarding the coronavirus, there is a big clash, a deep clash between the Orthodox and the authorities of the state, the police, Ministry of Health, etc. I don't have to tell you. I think the same story is taking place in New York. But it's not anti-Semitic, to your question. It's a dispute. It's a way for them to behave that's violent, goes against, they infect one another. Okay, but it's not anti-Semitic. Regarding the first question, I suggest, Michael, that you devote to it another seminar or another series of lectures next year, because it asks what is Zionism today? Okay, the Zionist political movement founded by Herzl. What did it want? It wanted the Jews to come back to their homeland and to establish a state. Now you can say, and now I'm answering the student, you can say that if Zionism achieved its goals, about half of the Jewish population in the world lives in Israel, birth rate is high, newcomers are coming, and there is a state, it achieved its goals. This is what the post-Zionists in Israel say. Now we should look for other ways to embody Zionism. So if you ask what it is today, when there is a state, what it is today is to maintain the state and to have it, to live in it as best as we can, and with as many values as we can. I'd like to remind you of Martin Buber's wonderful saying, the main thing is not that we live, that we are alive. The main thing is how do we live, okay? And Israelis think, I think most of them, that we are trying to maintain this Zionism by maintaining the state and by developing whatever we can, art, medicine, science, etc., and trying, David, to find a way to our neighbors. And again, we disagree, because you see there the other side, you see the point, but I think you less see the Israeli point of aspiring for some settlement with its neighbors. That's, I think, is the essence of Zionism today.
Thank you, Dina. I think that definitely answers this question. Let me pose the last two questions.
Do we have time for a quick response or not?
Yes, I want to say we have 5 minutes left, and we started with Professor Porat. We'll end with Professor Myers. So the last question, of course, you can also briefly respond, but I also wanted to ask, I think, an interesting question which came up in different forms by Nathan Glushka. A lot of Western students see this conflict as a white colonizing Jewish population versus the oppressed, darker-skinned Palestinians, but the situation on the ground in Israel shows a much more complex and less homogeneous population. I mean, I think he thinks also about, of course, Jews coming not from Europe, but from Arab countries, from Ethiopia and other places. And how do we take this on university campuses so it won't be just portrayed wrongly? And I think if you want to include that, that would be a nice ending of our discussion. But of course, you also feel free to respond as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question. I just want to briefly respond to the previous question and offer a few thoughts. One, about the Haredi population, the ultra-Orthodox population. As Dina mentioned, I've written on the idea of a principled anti-Zionism that is not anti-Semitic, especially drawing upon different circles of Jewish critics of Zionism, including but not restricted to Haredi Jews. Also, as Dina mentioned, the Bund and various other intellectuals scattered throughout the 20th century who adopted really a principled position that was born of passion, concern, and love for their Jewishness that was nonetheless anti-Zionist. One of the things that I think is interesting to note that we have seen in recent months and even weeks is an ongoing process of what I might call the Zionization of the Haredi population. The increasing identification of the Haredi population with a certain right-wing political agenda, both in Israel and in the United States. And I think that is coming with a softening of the harsh opposition to the state of Israel, as Israel comes to be seen as a source of their strong particularistic sense of Jewish collectivity. And that, I think, is not at all disconnected from the question about Zionism. I have to say here again, Dina, this is a case in which we'll have to agree to disagree. The essence of Zionism today is the Zionism of the nation-state law. I'm afraid to say what we have seen over the last 53 years is a winnowing down of this one-time expansive array of Zionist possibilities into one that is really, I think, shaped by two dates: by 1967, by the victory of Israel in the Six-Day War, and the unleashing of a new messianically driven religious Zionism, and 1977, Hamapach, the overturning of 30 years of Labor Party rule, when the revisionist Zionist Likud Party took control and introduced its form of a kind of majoritarian ethnocentric nationalism. I think those two factors have been enormously important in shaping the definition of Zionism as we understand it today, and really crowded out all other versions. I often wonder what a figure, not Martin Buber and not Yehuda Magnus, but Achad Ha'am would have felt, or what place he would have had in Israel of today with that particular form of majoritarian Zionism that manifests itself in the nation-state law. So I think I have a different view of the trajectory of history with respect to Zionism. That said, it's important to note that, for notwithstanding that rightward drift in the formulation of Zionism, Israel is an extraordinarily diverse place, and an extraordinarily, amongst the three major population groups that are absolutely essential to its future are the large population of Mizrahi or Middle Eastern Jews, the Haredi population, and the Arab population. They will represent together by very considerably so a majority of the population of Israel. Those three groups together, maybe even the Haredim and the Arabs. It was once thought by 2060 might represent a majority. So Israel is going to change. Whether it's going to tack back to the left or continue to the right, I don't know. But it is a multicultural society. And I think that's connected to, but not the only factor in addressing the question about Jews and whiteness, Jews as sort of part and parcel of the mainstream white population, even the vanguard of a kind of white power elite. I think, again, it's a complex question. That assertion that Jews are sort of the paradigmatic exemplars of white power ignores a lot of history, including the fact that 75 years ago, the most enlightened country in the world attempted to exterminate the entire Jewish population and succeeded in murdering 6 million Jews. And I think it's important to remember how profoundly marginalized Jews have been, including in recent history. At the same time, I think we can't ignore the fact that Jews have achieved positions of great prominence and are amply represented beyond their numbers in many important areas of life that lends itself to that association. I think here it's really important to remember the richness and fullness of history in understanding Jews' place in the struggle for justice. And I think it's important, I should add, for Jews to remember the experience of persecution as an animating force in their own moral and political bearing in the world.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.